They say the first thing you notice about a man like Dante Moretti isn't his face, or his voice, or the way he moves. It's the silence that walks into the room before he does. The air itself folds inward, the noise of the world goes still, and everyone seems to forget how to breathe, as if even the wind is waiting for permission to exist again. I didn't believe in that kind of presence. Not really. Not until that night when he stepped through the fog-smeared glass doors of Rosario's auto spa, the dim, grease-scented little corner of the city where I scrubbed away the sins of rich men's cars for just enough money to keep the lights on. I remember the way the fluorescent lights flickered, how the hum of the buffer in my hand suddenly sounded too loud, how Marco, my manager, straightened his back like a puppet whose strings had just been pulled. And then I saw him. Black suit, no tie, the faint glint of a gold watch that probably cost more than my entire building, and a face carved out of calm fury. The kind of face that never needed to raise its voice to make you understand you'd already gone too far. Dante Moretti. The name alone carried weight, whispered in alleys, murmured in bars, scribbled in police reports that never led anywhere. I'd seen him once before, months ago, when I'd been assigned to wash his car. A sleek black Lamborghini that looked like it was built to outrun God. He hadn't looked at me then, not really. He'd been on the phone, barking orders in Italian, cigarette smoke curling around his jaw like a halo made of sin. But tonight his eyes found me immediately, like he'd been waiting for this moment, like he already knew exactly who I was. "Shut it down," he said, voice smooth and quiet. Yet it rolled through the garage like thunder trapped in a glass bottle. Marco scrambled to obey, cutting the machines, plunging us into an eerie half-silence filled only by the dripping of water from the freshly rinsed cars. He walked toward me, slow, deliberate, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. And I swear every muscle in my body wanted to run, but something stubborn inside me refused to move. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe it was just that I'd had enough of being stepped on by powerful men who thought they could take what they wanted without question. "You're Ava Moreno," he said, stopping just close enough that I could smell the faint burn of his cologne. Something sharp, woodsy, expensive, dangerous. "Yes, sir," I managed, my voice steadier than my heart. He smiled, but there was nothing kind in it. "Good. Then this will be easy." He turned slightly, and one of his men, tall, bald, wearing black gloves like he'd just walked out of a crime scene, stepped forward and dropped a small velvet pouch on the hood of the car I'd just finished cleaning. It made a dull, heavy sound, and when Dante opened it, what spilled out wasn't coins or cash, but the glittering accusation of diamonds. "My money clip," he said, "missing for 3 days. Last seen right here when this car was washed by you." The words sliced through me, sharp and clean. For a heartbeat, I couldn't even respond. My brain was too busy trying to understand how something like this could happen. I didn't... He raised a hand, silencing me instantly. "Don't lie to me, Ava. I have patience for almost everything. Mistakes, disrespect, even betrayal when it's honest. But I have no patience for liars." I could feel everyone watching, Marco, the other mechanics, the detailers, even the kid who emptied trash cans, all frozen, pretending to be invisible. Because when a man like Dante Moretti accuses you of theft, it's not just your job on the line, it's your life. "I didn't steal anything," I said, finally finding my voice. "If it was missing, maybe someone else." "You were the only one who touched the car," he interrupted, eyes narrowing like the barrel of a gun. "The cameras show that." For a second I almost laughed, not because it was funny, God no, but because I'd spent the last 3 nights trying to get those damn security cameras fixed. They'd been glitching for weeks, always freezing or going black for a few seconds. Marco never bothered to repair them because who would steal from billionaires' cars anyway? But I knew what I saw that night, a flicker of static, a shadow that didn't belong to me. and suddenly it hit me like cold rain down my spine. Someone had set me up. "You're wrong," I said, more fiercely this time. "I didn't take anything. I don't care who you are or how much money you have. I'm not a thief." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You think my name protects you? Or yours does?" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt louder than a shout. "I've buried men for less than what you've done." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I didn't look away. I couldn't. "Then maybe you've buried the wrong people," I said, before I could stop myself. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even admiration. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He nodded once, slow, almost thoughtful. "You've got a spine," he said. "I'll give you that." He picked up the pouch of diamonds, turned it in his hand, then looked back at me. "You have 24 hours, Ava Moreno. Find out where my clip went, prove you didn't take it, and maybe I'll forget this ever happened. And if I can't?" The smile he gave me was the kind that burned. "Then you'll wish you never touched my car." He turned and walked away, his men following silently, boots echoing like distant thunder until the sound faded, and all that was left was the smell of oil, soap, and fear. Marco didn't say a word. Nobody did. I just stood there, soaking wet, heart trembling in my chest, my reflection wavering on the Lamborghini's dark glass, like a ghost watching her own life unravel. 24 hours. That was all he gave me. When I finally went back to my tiny apartment that night, the city lights smeared across the rain-streaked windows. I couldn't stop replaying his voice in my head. Deep, smooth, merciless. "You have 24 hours. But as I locked my door, as the sound of distant sirens bled through the walls, I saw the shadow of a car parked across the street. Black, silent, waiting. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. Dante Moretti wasn't just giving me time. He was watching me. And whoever had framed me, whoever had really stolen that money clip, was still out there, smiling in the dark, knowing that the clock had already started ticking. The next morning began the way nightmares do. Not with screams or alarms, but with silence. That strange, heavy kind of silence that sits on your chest like an invisible weight, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to tell if you're even awake or still trapped in the dark. I woke before dawn, though I couldn't have told you if I'd really slept at all, my mind still tangled in the echo of Dante Moretti's voice. Those words, "You have 24 hours," circling my head like a curse that refused to loosen its grip. The rain had stopped, but the city still wore the scent of it. That metallic dampness that seeps into your skin and makes everything feel raw, unfinished, a little broken. I didn't have a plan, not really, just a stubborn certainty that I couldn't let him win, couldn't let him walk into my workplace, accuse me in front of everyone, and walk out as though my life were his to play with. I wasn't some scared little girl from the corner of nowhere who'd curl up and cry when a man in a suit raised his voice. No, I'd fought harder than that just to survive this city, to pay my bills, to keep my brother in school, to pretend that I had control over anything. But underneath that anger, buried deep where I didn't want to look, was something colder, sharper, more dangerous, fear. And not just of him, but of what his kind of power meant. Because men like Dante didn't accuse without reason, and they didn't forget without proof. By the time I got to Rosario's, the morning shift was already there, but the usual rhythm, the hum of hoses, the crackle of radios, the easy jokes that made the day bearable, was gone. The moment I walked in, conversations stopped, shoulders stiffened, and eyes slid away like I'd suddenly become radioactive. Marco was in his office with the blinds half closed, talking in low, urgent tones on the phone, and I knew without hearing the words that the story had already spread. People had seen. People had heard. And now I was the thief. The thief who had the audacity to steal from a mafia boss. I went straight to my station, refusing to let my hands shake as I filled the bucket with water and soap. Because that's what people expect when you're cornered. That you'll crumble, that you'll beg, that you'll confirm their worst assumptions. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. If they were going to whisper, then I would give them something worth whispering about. Composure, defiance, the quiet kind of strength that makes gossip feel small. Marco came out a few minutes later, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes darting to me, then away. "Ava," he started, his voice low, cautious, like he was talking to a live grenade. "Look, I don't know what you got yourself into, but this thing with Moretti, it's bad, real bad. He called this morning." I looked up, wiping my hands on my rag. And he said you're on some kind of clock," Marco said, swallowing. "He wants answers by tonight. He told me not to fire you, said he'd handle it himself if you didn't find what he's missing." His voice cracked a little at that, and for the first time I saw it. The genuine fear in his eyes. Not for me, but for himself. For the garage. For the collateral damage that always follows men like Dante when they're crossed. "I didn't steal from him," I said again. But even as the words left my mouth, they felt tired, hollow, like I'd been repeating them too long to anyone who cared to believe them. Marco sighed, rubbing his face. "I believe you, kid. But belief doesn't matter when the devil's got your name on his tongue." He walked away, leaving me there with the smell of soap and exhaust, and the faint tremor of panic trying to claw its way out of my throat. I knew who I had to talk to. The night the Lamborghini was brought in, I wasn't alone in the detail bay. Eli, one of the junior mechanics, had been there too, a kid barely out of his teens, all tattoos and nervous energy, who used to crack jokes about how I worked faster than anyone else because I washed cars like I was scrubbing the world clean of sin. He'd been the one who logged the car's arrival, handled the intake forms, even ran the vacuum through the interior before I started. If someone tampered with that car, he would have seen it, or done it. So during lunch break, when the others scattered to smoke or scroll through their phones, I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the back lot where Eli usually hung around with the tow drivers. The air was cold and smelled faintly of gasoline. A stray cat darted between the tires piled against the fence, and somewhere a radio played an old love song too sweet for a place like this. But Eli wasn't there. His tools were still scattered on the workbench. Wrench, gloves, half-empty soda can. But no sign of him. I asked around, and one of the guys said he hadn't shown up all morning, hadn't called, hadn't even picked up his paycheck from last week. A knot twisted in my stomach. That wasn't like him. Eli never missed a shift, not because he cared about the job, but because he needed the money. His mom was sick, everyone knew that, and he used to joke that the only reason he worked so hard was because hospitals didn't accept good intentions as payment. For him to vanish now, of all times, right after Dante's accusation, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like warning. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to his number, pressing call, my thumb trembling just enough to make me hate myself for it. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. I tried again. Nothing. And that's when I noticed it. A car idling across the street, windows tinted too dark for city regulations, engine running low and steady like a heartbeat. The same kind of car I'd seen outside my apartment last night. My chest tightened. For a moment, I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just some random guy waiting for someone. That paranoia was eating at me because of what Dante had said. But when I started walking back toward the garage, the car's headlights flickered once, like a signal, and then it pulled away slow and silent, disappearing around the corner. I stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears, the phone still in my hand, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth. Whoever had taken that money clip, Whoever had framed me wasn't just after the diamonds. They wanted something bigger, and I was caught in the middle of it. When I finally went back inside, the garage felt colder, emptier. People still avoided my eyes, and Marco wouldn't meet my gaze at all. On the counter near the register, someone had left a folded newspaper. Local businessman questioned in organized crime inquiry. And below the headline was a picture of Dante Moretti, smirking like a man who owned the world and the shadows that came with it. That night, I walked home through streets that felt too quiet, every reflection in the puddles stretching longer than it should, every sound carrying farther than it used to. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing, only the city's empty promise of safety. When I reached my apartment building, the front door was ajar. Just slightly. Enough to make the air catch in my throat. I hadn't left it that way. I stepped inside, every sense sharpened, my heart clawing at my ribs. The room looked normal, the same cracked coffee mug on the table, the same flickering lamp in the corner. But there, on the counter, sitting where I would see it first, was something that didn't belong. A small velvet pouch. Black. Familiar. The same kind Dante Moretti had poured diamonds from. My hands trembled as I picked it up, feeling the faint weight inside. Not as heavy as before, but enough to make my stomach twist with dread. Attached to it was a single piece of paper, folded neatly, with a single line written in sharp, elegant handwriting. "You're running out of time." When the knock came, it wasn't polite. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't the kind of knock you hear from a neighbor asking to borrow sugar or from a landlord coming to collect rent. It was deliberate, heavy, the kind of knock that makes the walls shiver a little, the kind that tells you whoever is on the other side already owns the air you're breathing. It came just as the clock on my kitchen wall clicked over to midnight. A sound so ordinary and yet so final that for a single heartbeat I thought about pretending I wasn't home, about standing completely still and hoping whoever it was would fade back into the darkness. But deep down I knew, long before I opened the door, that this night was never going to let me hide. Rain slicked against the windows, whispering down the glass in uneven trails, and the city outside looked like it had been drowned in ink. Every street lamp bleeding light across puddles that reflected nothing but ghosts. I crossed the room slowly, every creak of the floorboards sounding too loud. The velvet pouch still lying on the counter like a loaded gun I hadn't dared to touch since I found it. My heart kept saying, "Don't open that door." But curiosity, or maybe defiance, or maybe the same reckless thread of pride that had gotten me into this mess in the first place, kept my hand moving toward the handle. When I opened it, the hallway flooded with the scent of rain and smoke and something darker, something expensive and male and dangerous. And there he was, Dante Moretti, his hair wet, his black shirt clinging to him, his coat unbuttoned, and his eyes burning like two storms that had finally found where to land. For a long second, neither of us spoke. The sound of the rain filling the silence between us, a strange rhythm of threat and tension, and something else I didn't want to name. "You shouldn't open your door so easily," he said finally, his voice low, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted. "Not when you don't know who's on the other side." "I knew it was you," I answered, and though I meant it to sound steady, there was a faint tremor beneath the words. Not of fear exactly, but of awareness. Of the realization that my entire apartment suddenly felt too small to hold both of us. His gaze flicked past me, landing on the counter where the pouch sat like an accusation waiting for its cue. "So," he murmured, stepping inside without waiting for permission, closing the door behind him with the softest click, a sound that felt far louder in my chest than it did in the room. "You've decided to make things interesting?" "I didn't put that there," I said quickly, because the lie of omission was pointless now. He would see it. He would ask. and there was no version of this story where pretending ignorance would save me. Someone broke in. They left it. Someone? He repeated, tilting, his head slightly, as if tasting the word. You expect me to believe that the same clip that disappeared from my car just happened to reappear in your kitchen, like a gift from some mysterious benefactor? His voice carried no anger, and that terrified me more than if he had been shouting, because calm meant control, and men like Dante Moretti used control the way other men used weapons. I don't care what you believe, I said, though the words scraped out of me raw and uneven. But I didn't steal from you, and whoever did wants you to think I did. Maybe you should start looking a little closer at your own people. He moved closer, every step deliberate, the air tightening until there was barely room left to breathe. And when he stopped in front of me, the world felt like it had shrunk to the space between his heartbeat and mine. Careful, Ava, he said softly, and my name in his mouth sounded like both a warning and a promise. Accusing my people is dangerous. Accusing me might be fatal. Something inside me snapped a little then. The exhaustion, the fear, the injustice of it all. And before I could think better of it, I met his stare and said, "Then kill me and get it over with, but stop pretending you want the truth if you've already decided I'm guilty." For a moment, one impossible, breathless moment, his mask slipped, just a fraction, and I saw the flicker of surprise, maybe even respect, before the corners of his mouth curved into that small, lethal smile that made my stomach twist. "You really don't know when to be afraid, do you?" "I'm terrified," I whispered. "I just don't see the point of showing it to you." He looked at me a long time after that, silent, unreadable, then turned away and picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "These aren't all the diamonds," he said quietly. "Whoever delivered this to you kept most of them." That hit harder than I expected. So someone's playing us both. He glanced back at me, eyes narrowing just enough to make my pulse stutter. "You say that like we're on the same side." "Maybe we are," I said, before I could stop myself, because the truth was clawing its way out, and because, despite everything, I wanted him to believe me. "Whoever did this knew it would turn you against me. They knew it would make you come after me, and now they're out there with your diamonds and my name on their lips. You think I'm your enemy, but maybe I'm the only person who actually gives a damn about clearing this mess up." Silence again, heavier this time, filled with the hum of the rain and the quiet creak of the building settling around us. He studied me, not like a man studying a suspect, but like someone trying to decide whether the person in front of him was a trap or a revelation. Finally, he said, "You have spirit. It's either going to save you or destroy you. I haven't decided which yet." He slid the pouch into his coat pocket and stepped closer, so close I could see the faint scar near his jawline, the tiny imperfection that made his beauty dangerous. "You want to prove your innocence? Fine, work for me. My driver will pick you up tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I blinked. "Work for you? Doing what?" "Finding out who thought it was a good idea to frame you," he said simply. "And while you're at it, you'll be under my protection. Consider it collateral against your own bad luck." The idea of walking willingly into his world felt like stepping into a fire just to prove I wouldn't burn, and yet something in the way he said it, quiet, absolute, inevitable, made it clear that this wasn't a choice dressed up as kindness. It was an order wearing the thin disguise of opportunity. "I already have a job," I said, even though it sounded pathetic the moment it left my mouth. "Not anymore," he answered, and there was no cruelty in it, just certainty, as if the universe itself bent when he spoke. "Rosario's will be closed for a few days. Safety inspection." He said the words with a small shrug, like he was mentioning the weather, but we both knew what he meant. I was out of options. He turned toward the door, hand on the knob, and then paused, glancing back at me. Don't pack too much. My world doesn't leave a lot of room for baggage. Why me? I asked, the question spilling out before I could hold it back. You have men. You have money. You could find the thief without me. He looked at me for a long, long moment, and there was something unreadable in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper, something that scared me more than threats ever could. Because, he said finally, I can't decide if you're the unluckiest woman I've ever met, or the most dangerous. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway until all that was left was the rain and the smell of smoke and the low, relentless thrum of my own heartbeat trying to catch up with what had just happened. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, my mind a whirl of questions and dread, and that strange pull I didn't want to name. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Work for him. The words felt unreal, like something whispered in a fever dream, and yet every instinct in me knew that once I stepped into his world, there would be no stepping back. When I finally turned out the lights and crawled into bed, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the doorway, the rain sliding down his cheek like tears that would never fall. And I kept thinking about that pouch and the diamonds that were missing and the person who had left it here like a warning. Because whoever had started this wasn't done. And if Dante Moretti wanted me under his roof, it wasn't just protection he was offering. It was a cage made of silk and danger and secrets I wasn't ready to learn. There is a certain stillness that lives inside power. A silence so absolute it almost hums, like the quiet before lightning strikes. And that was the first thing I noticed when Dante Moretti's car pulled up to the gates of his estate the next morning. That eerie, unnatural hush that makes you forget how to breathe for just a second, because everything around you feels like it's holding its breath, too. The iron gates rose from the mist like black ribs carved into the sky, and beyond them, the long driveway curved through manicured gardens that looked too perfect to be real, the kind of perfection that costs blood, not just money. The driver, a man whose name I didn't know, and whose face gave away nothing, didn't speak the entire ride, and I didn't ask him anything, because the air inside that car was thick with unspoken warnings. I watched the city fall away behind us, replaced by long stretches of green and gray and silence, until it felt like I'd been driven not to another part of town, but into a different world altogether, one built from marble and shadow and control. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, I hesitated before getting out, staring at the towering facade of glass and stone, at the sharp edges and the impossible symmetry that screamed money, precision, and danger. The house wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was too cold, too sharp, too perfect. But there was something magnetic about it. The way it dominated the landscape. The way it seemed to watch you rather than the other way around. The front doors opened before I could reach them, and a man in a tailored suit stepped aside with a polite nod, his expression the exact opposite of welcoming. "Mr. Moretti is expecting you," he said, his voice smooth and empty. And I wondered how many people had heard that same sentence before walking into this house, and never walking out again. Inside, the silence was thicker. The floors gleamed like liquid glass, reflecting the tall ceilings and the soft golden light filtering through the windows. Art lined the walls. Not the kind you find in museums, but the kind you hear about in whispered rumors, the kind that disappears from galleries and reappears in private collections owned by men who don't answer to anyone. I could smell polish and leather, and something faintly metallic beneath it all, like the house itself had a pulse. Dante was standing in the foyer when I entered, dressed in another black suit, his tie loosened, a faint shadow of stubble darkening his jaw. And for a moment, the only thing I could do was stare. Because there was something about the way he carried himself that made every inch of the room bend subtly toward him, like gravity had chosen a new center. "You're late," he said, though his watch told me I was exactly on time. Your driver didn't seem in a hurry, I replied, unable to stop the words, and his mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make my chest tighten in ways I didn't want to name. Come, he said, turning on his heel, expecting me to follow. And of course I did, because what else could I do? He led me through hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, past rooms filled with quiet opulence, a library with walls of books and the faint smell of old paper, a sitting room with crystal decanters of amber liquid, a grand staircase that spiraled upward into a shadowed second floor. Every detail whispered of wealth, yes, but also of control, of deliberate taste, of a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Finally, he stopped in front of a large door and opened it, revealing an office that looked like it had been carved from the night itself. Black marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, and in the center a massive desk scattered with papers and one single object that made my stomach twist. The ledger. The same one I had glimpsed once before when I cleaned his car, its edge marked with something dark and dried that had looked too much like blood to be ink. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Sit. I sat, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, and watched as he poured 2 glasses of something that smelled like whiskey, though I had a feeling the label on that bottle cost more than my yearly rent. He handed me one, and when I didn't take it right away, he said, Relax. If I wanted to kill you, you wouldn't be sitting. That wasn't comforting, but I took the glass anyway, if only to keep my hands from shaking. He studied me for a moment, leaning back in his chair, the light catching in his eyes in a way that made it impossible to tell whether he was amused or assessing. You think someone framed you, he said. Not a question, but a statement. I know someone did. And you think they're one of my people? I hesitated. I think whoever it was knew enough about your schedule, your habits, your security, to make it look like I was the thief. That doesn't sound like an outsider to me. He didn't react. Not really. Just swirled the whiskey in his glass and said, You've got nerve. I'll give you that. Maybe that's all I've got left, I said quietly. He laughed then, low and genuine, and the sound sent a strange shiver down my spine, because it was the first time I'd heard him laugh, and it wasn't cruel. You might be right, he said, but nerve alone won't save you here. You're in my world now, Ava. In my world, everyone's a liar until they've bled enough to prove otherwise. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, there was a knock on the door, and a man entered. Younger, tall, with slicked back hair and eyes that darted toward me and then away. He handed Dante a folder and murmured something too low for me to catch, and I watched as Dante's expression changed, sharpening into something colder. When the man left, Dante opened the folder and pushed it across the desk toward me. Inside were photographs, blurry security stills, timestamps, shadows, my face, my hands, the Lamborghini. This was taken the night the clip went missing, he said. Except for one problem. The timestamp is wrong. It says 10:47 p.m., but the garage closed at 9. Someone tampered with the footage. For a moment, the room tilted. So you believe me? I didn't say that, he replied smoothly. But it seems someone wants me to keep you busy while they move the rest of my diamonds somewhere they shouldn't. The words hit like a physical thing. The rest of my diamonds. And I realized just how far this went. This wasn't about a single missing clip or a misunderstanding. This was about money, territory, betrayal. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice low, almost a whisper. I want you to keep doing what you were doing before, he said, leaning forward. Watch. Listen. People will talk around you because they think you're harmless. You're not one of us, which means they'll underestimate you. I want you to find me the ghost hiding in my house. And if I refuse? He smiled faintly. You won't. And the worst part was, he was right. Because even though every part of me screamed to run, to get out before his world swallowed me whole, something deeper, something darker, had already started to pull me toward him, toward the danger, toward the truth. When I left his office, one of his men escorted me to the guest room, a space so vast and silent it made me feel small, in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. The bed was too soft, the air too clean, and the view from the window showed a garden lit with small golden lamps that looked almost gentle if you didn't know what kind of man owned them. As I sat on the edge of that impossibly perfect bed, staring at my reflection in the glass, I thought about Eli, the missing mechanic, about the diamonds, about the ledger on Dante's desk, and about the way his eyes had lingered just a little too long when I spoke. Somewhere in this house was the truth that could save me, or destroy me, and I had the sinking feeling that before I found it, I'd have to lose more than just my innocence. There is a strange kind of quiet that lives inside houses like Dante Moretti's, a silence that isn't born from peace but from power, from secrets too heavy to move, from stories that have been buried under marble floors and locked behind eyes that never flinch. And as the days slipped past in that vast, glittering cage, I learned to recognize the different shades of that silence. The one that meant danger, the one that meant curiosity, and the one that meant something was breaking just beneath the surface. He kept his distance most of the time, though distance in Dante's world still meant being watched, still meant feeling the weight of unseen eyes as I moved through his house pretending to belong, pretending to be useful, pretending that I wasn't afraid every time one of his men passed too close. I was supposed to listen, to notice, to report. That was the arrangement. But it was hard to play spy when the walls themselves felt alive, when every corridor seemed to breathe, when every whisper sounded like it might belong to someone who wouldn't hesitate to make me disappear. Still, I tried. I listened. I watched. I learned that Dante's people feared him, but they also loved him in a way that was more dangerous than fear, because love like that doesn't question, doesn't rebel, it simply obeys. I learned that there were rules in this house, old, invisible ones. No one entered his office without permission. No one asked about his past. No one spoke his name after dark unless they wanted the air to change. And I learned, slowly, that Dante himself was not as unshakable as he pretended to be. It started with small things. The way he would linger in the doorway when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his jaw tightened when he caught one of his men staring at me for too long. The way his voice softened just slightly when he asked if I was eating, sleeping, coping. At first, I told myself it was control, that he was just making sure his pawn didn't break before the game was over. But there were moments when control looked too much like concern, and concern, in a man like him, was a warning all its own. One evening, I found myself alone in the library, the rain tapping softly against the windows like a heartbeat, the smell of old leather and ink wrapping around me as I traced my fingers along the spines of books I'd never have the time to read. I don't know what made me pull the one I did, an old volume bound in black, with no title on the cover. But when I opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped free and fluttered to the floor. It wasn't a note. It was a photograph. A younger Dante stood in the center of the picture, shirtless, his knuckles bruised, blood smeared across his chest, a grin that didn't reach his eyes cutting across his face. Beside him was another man, taller, blonde, holding the same smile, the kind that belongs to men who believe they'll live forever. But on the back of the photo, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, were 4 words that made my skin prickle. He died for loyalty. I don't know why, but I hid the photo in my pocket before I could think better of it, as though the paper itself might tell me something Dante never would. I turned to put the book back, and froze. He was standing in the doorway. "Find something interesting?" he asked, voice low, steady, unreadable. My pulse jumped so hard it hurt. "Just a book," I said too quickly. He stepped inside, the soft sound of his shoes on the marble floor somehow louder than the rain, and came to stand beside me, his presence so close it made the air tremble. "You like to explore," he said, not accusing, not quite approving either. "You said to listen, to watch," I replied, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I'm just doing what you told me?" He smiled faintly, but his eyes didn't. "Careful. Some doors here open to things you can't unsee." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, and in it, something shifted. Not quite trust, not quite desire, but something that lived somewhere between. He reached out, slowly, his hand brushing a loose strand of hair from my face, and the touch was light, almost reverent, but it set every nerve in me alight. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to figure out whether I'm the monster they say I am," he murmured, his voice dipping lower, almost tender. "Maybe I am," I said, though the words trembled. "And what do you see?" I met his gaze, searching for the answer, and what I saw there terrified me. Not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. There was loneliness, and guilt, and something raw that looked a lot like longing. "I see a man who's afraid to stop being the monster," I whispered. He stared at me for a long, long time and then quietly said, "Maybe you're right." He turned away before I could respond, walking to the window, his shoulders tense beneath his shirt. "Do you know why I don't believe in innocence anymore, Ava?" I shook my head, though I knew he wasn't really asking. "Because everyone has a price," he said softly, watching the rain. "Everyone wants something. Money, power, revenge, love. It's all the same currency. People will betray anything to buy it." "Then what do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked back at me then, and for a moment I thought he might actually tell me. The truth, the real truth. But instead he smiled. That slow, dangerous smile that hid more than it revealed. "I want to know why someone thought you were worth framing." The words lingered in the air between us like smoke, heavy and impossible to breathe around, and I realized he wasn't just asking about the theft anymore. He was asking about me, about who I was, about what kind of person stands her ground when threatened by a man like him. Before I could answer, a noise outside the room broke the moment. A crash, hurried footsteps, raised voices. Dante's expression changed instantly, all softness gone, replaced by sharp, lethal focus. He moved past me in one smooth motion, pulling a gun from the back of his waistband as naturally as if it were an extension of his hand. "Stay here," he said, already halfway out the door. But of course I didn't. I followed him down the hall, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips, until we reached the grand staircase where two of his men were arguing in low, tense voices. One of them held a phone, the other had blood on his knuckles. Dante didn't shout. He didn't need to. A single look from him froze them both. "What happened?" he asked, his tone deadly calm. The man with the phone swallowed hard. "We found him, boss. The mechanic. Eli." My stomach dropped. "Where?" "Dock 39. The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward me, then back to Dante. "He's dead." For a second, everything stopped. The sound, the breath, the heartbeat, everything. And then Dante turned, his gaze finding mine, sharp as a blade. "Go back to your room," he said quietly. I didn't move. "You think I did this?" "No," he said, and the way he said it, soft, certain, made my throat tighten. "But someone wants you to think you're next." He turned away then, barking orders in Italian, his men scattering, and I stood there, frozen, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. "Someone wants you to think you're next." I went back to my room eventually, though I couldn't remember walking there. The house felt different now. Colder, sharper, like the silence itself had teeth. I sat on the bed, staring at the rain streaking the window, and for the first time I realized how deep I'd fallen into a world I didn't understand, a world that had already started to change me. And when I finally reached into my pocket and pulled out that photograph again, my fingers trembling, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the image, behind the two men smiling for the camera, a shadow half caught in the frame. Tall, familiar, watching. It wasn't just Dante and the blonde man in that photo. There was a third figure, and I had seen him before, standing in the halls of this house, smiling like he had nothing to hide. Morning came not with light, but with a kind of gray exhaustion that felt stitched into my bones. The kind that makes the air taste like metal and regret. The kind that reminds you some nights never truly end. They just change their shape. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. The rain had stopped, but the house still felt wet with it. The windows streaked with fading droplets that caught the dull gleam of dawn, and the memory of what I'd learned the night before, of Eli's body found at the docks, of the shadow in that photograph, pressed against my chest like an invisible hand. There are moments in life when fear stops being sharp and starts becoming something else, something colder and heavier, something that no longer makes you tremble but instead roots itself deep inside you until every breath feels borrowed. And that was the kind of fear that followed me as I walked the corridors of Dante Moretti's house that morning. I didn't know if I was more terrified of what I might find, or of what I might already know. I told myself I was only looking for answers, that curiosity was safer than ignorance. But part of me, the reckless, aching part that couldn't stop thinking about the way Dante had looked at me the night before, the way his voice had softened just for me, wanted something else, something I couldn't name without feeling ashamed. Because even now, even with danger all around me, a part of me was drawn to him the way fire draws the moth. Not because it promises warmth, but because it promises an ending that feels like meaning. The photograph weighed in my pocket like a secret begging to be discovered. I knew the face of the man in the background now. Luca, one of Dante's lieutenants, the quiet one with the kind eyes and the careful smile, the one who always seemed to fade into the background whenever Dante entered the room. I'd seen him that first day in the foyer, his hand brushing his jacket just slightly where a gun would be, and I remembered thinking how strange it was that someone so soft-spoken could move with such precision. Now, looking back, it didn't seem strange at all. It seemed planned. I waited until the house began to stir, until footsteps and murmurs filled the air again, and then I slipped down the hall toward Dante's office. I knew I shouldn't. I knew the rules. But curiosity had always been my downfall, and I needed to see that ledger again. Needed to know what was written inside that could make men like Eli vanish and men like Luca hide in photographs with ghosts. The door was unlocked, which should have warned me. But I was too focused to stop. Inside, the air was still, faintly perfumed with smoke and whiskey. The desk exactly as I remembered. Clean, controlled, deliberate. Except now the ledger lay open, pages fanned out like a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. I stepped closer, my heart beating too fast, eyes scanning the rows of numbers and names written in Dante's careful hand. Shipping routes, codes, transactions, and then, near the bottom of one page, a name I recognized, E. Santoro, Eli. Next to it, 2 words, payment complete. The room tilted for a second. My stomach dropped. Payment complete. He'd been working for them, or against them, or maybe both. I didn't know. But the truth was there in black ink. Dante knew about Eli long before his body turned up. Before I could think, before I could even breathe, a voice came from the doorway, calm and cold and unmistakable. "You shouldn't be in here." I turned. Luca stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting against the doorframe, his eyes unreadable. You're not very good at following rules, he said, stepping inside, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that made the back of my neck prickle. I could say the same about you, I managed, though my voice betrayed me, trembling in the wrong places. He smiled then, and it wasn't kind. You've been asking questions, looking where you shouldn't. That's dangerous. I took a step back, trying to think, trying to remember where Dante was if anyone would hear me if I screamed, but Luca kept coming closer, slow, methodical, like a man who'd already decided how the story ends. You think you know something? He said. You think you're clever? That photo you found, you should have burned it. So he knew. He knew about the photo, about the shadow, about everything. I swallowed hard. Eli didn't steal the diamonds, did he? You did. You set him up. You set me up. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, not exactly, but the faint irritation of being understood. Eli was greedy, he said simply, and you were convenient. Dante knows, I said, trying to sound stronger than I felt. He laughed, low and quiet, and it was the kind of laugh that doesn't belong to someone who's amused. Dante doesn't know anything. He thinks with his pride, not his head. And you've already gotten under his skin. That's why this has to end now. He reached for me, and instinct, raw, terrified instinct, took over. I grabbed the ledger and swung it, catching him across the arm just enough to make him stumble. Papers scattered like snow. I bolted for the door, but he was faster. His hand caught my wrist, hard, twisting it back until I gasped. Let go, I hissed, but he only tightened his grip. Too late for that, he said, voice low, almost tender in its cruelty. You should have stayed the car washer girl. Before I could answer, before I could scream, before I could even think, the door burst open with a sound like thunder. Dante stood there, gun drawn, his expression unreadable but his voice cold enough to cut steel. Luca. For a moment, everything froze. Luca's hand still on me, my pulse hammering in my throat. Dante's eyes flicking between us, assessing, calculating. Then slowly Luca let go. It's not what it looks like, he said, his tone calm, practiced. She was in your office. She found the ledger. I was stopping her. But Dante wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on me now, and I could see the storm building behind his eyes, the same one that had terrified me the first time we met. Except now there was something else in it too. Fear. Get out, he said to Luca, voice soft but lethal. Luca hesitated, then smiled, the kind of smile that promises unfinished business. Of course, he said, brushing past him on the way out. But as he left, his eyes met mine for a split second, and in that look I understood. This wasn't over. When he was gone, Dante closed the door and turned to me. What were you doing? He demanded. I was trying to help, I said, and it came out desperate, angry, everything I'd been holding in. You wanted me to find out who framed me. Well, I did. It's him, Luca. He killed Eli and he's moving your diamonds and he's probably going to come for you next. Dante's jaw tightened, his hand flexing around the gun. For a long, unbearable moment he didn't speak. Then he crossed the room, closing the space between us until I could feel the aisa heat of him, the weight of him, the danger radiating from every inch. You think I don't know when someone's lying to me? He said quietly. I'm not lying. He studied me, eyes searching mine, and something inside me broke. Not from fear, but from the unbearable ache of wanting him to believe me. Finally, he said, If you're wrong about this, Ava, I can't protect you. And if I'm right. He exhaled, slow, controlled, but I saw it, the flicker of doubt, the shadow of trust. Then I'll kill him myself. The silence between us after that felt like fire. He lowered the gun, placed it on the desk, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then he reached out and touched my cheek, so lightly it almost didn't feel real. "You shouldn't be in my world," he said softly. "It's going to destroy you." "Maybe," I whispered, "but right now, your world is the only thing keeping me alive." He stared at me like he wanted to say something more, but the moment passed, slipping away like smoke. "Stay in your room tonight," he said finally, stepping back. "Lock the door. No one comes in, not even me." And as he left, closing the door behind him, I realized that his warning wasn't just about Luca. It was about himself. There is a certain kind of darkness that doesn't come from the absence of light, but from the weight of knowing too much. From realizing that the truth is never clean, never kind. And as I lay awake that night in Dante Moretti's mansion, my door locked, my pulse a fragile rhythm beneath the hum of silence, I felt that darkness pressing down on me, thick and suffocating, until it was hard to tell whether the sound I kept hearing was the wind or my own heartbeat trying to claw its way out. I didn't trust the walls of that room, not anymore. I didn't trust the stillness either, because in Dante's house, silence was never safety. It was always anticipation, always the pause before something broke. I sat on the edge of the bed, with my knees pulled close, the photograph still clutched in my hand like some fragile proof that I wasn't going mad, that what I'd seen, what I'd felt, was real. The faint glow of the garden light spilled through the curtains, throwing shifting patterns across the floor, and every time they moved, my nerves flinched like they expected a shadow to detach itself and come closer. I don't know how long I stayed like that, counting breaths, listening to the muffled whisper of footsteps far below. But when the knock finally came, soft, deliberate, 2 beats and a pause, I already knew it was him. "Open the door, Ava," Dante's voice said quietly from the other side, calm and low. But there was something under it, something that didn't belong to calm at all. Urgency, maybe even fear. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the lock but not turning it. "You told me not to open the door," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. I changed my mind. There was a sound then, faint and sharp, like metal being drawn, a weapon, or maybe just the ghost of one, and that was enough to make me move. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, and there he was, dressed in black, his hair slightly damp as though he'd stepped out into the night, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "You need to come with me," he said, not a question, not even a request. "What happened?" He glanced down the hallway, then back at me. "Luca's gone. He took 2 men with him. He knows I'm onto him." For a heartbeat, the air left my lungs. "Gone where?" "I don't know yet," he said, his voice tight, clipped in a way that told me this was not the calm, untouchable man the city feared. This was the man beneath, the one fighting to stay in control while everything around him slipped through his fingers. "But he won't get far." He turned, gesturing for me to follow, and I did, my bare feet soundless on the cold marble floors as we moved through the hallways that had begun to feel less like a mansion and more like the inside of a storm. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls, and the deeper we went, the more I realized that I wasn't being taken to safety. I was being taken deeper into his world, into the part of the house no one else seemed to see. We descended a narrow staircase hidden behind a paneled door I'd never noticed before, the air growing colder, denser, until it smelled faintly of iron and dust. When we reached the bottom, the space opened into what looked like a cellar, but not one meant for wine or storage. This was something else entirely. It was a place built for secrets. Bare concrete walls, a single hanging light, and in the center, a steel table with papers and photographs spread across it. Maps of the city, marked routes, faces circled in red ink. "This is how you catch thieves?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness, part awe, part disbelief. This is how I stay alive, he said, his tone flat but heavy with meaning. He picked up one of the photographs and handed it to me. A blurred image of Luca shaking hands with another man, older, thinner, his face half-turned but familiar in a way that made my stomach knot. You recognize him? It took me a moment to find my voice. That's Rosario, I said. The owner of the garage. My boss. Dante nodded once, his jaw tight. They've been working together. The diamonds, the shipment. They were moving them through his shop, hiding them in the cars he sent me. Eli found out. That's why he's dead. I stared at the photograph, the realization sinking in like poison, because suddenly all the pieces I'd been holding in separate hands, the missing clip, the broken cameras, Eli's disappearance, clicked into place, forming a picture that was clearer and uglier than I could stand. Why involve me? I whispered. Why frame me at all? Because you were the perfect distraction, Dante said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. A clean name, a pretty face, someone no one would ever suspect of being a pawn in a war. His words hit harder than they should have. Maybe because they were true, maybe because of the way he said them. Not cruelly, but with a kind of regret that made my chest ache. And what am I now? I asked. He looked at me for a long time, and for once he didn't have an answer. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the small scar near his jaw that I'd noticed before, the one that seemed older than the rest of him. You shouldn't be here, he said softly, almost to himself. Every minute you stay, you make it harder for me to let you go. The room felt smaller then, the air thicker, the silence heavier, and I hated the way my body betrayed me, the way my pulse raced, the way my breath caught, the way my skin burned just from the closeness of him. Then let me go, I said, though the words felt false even as I spoke them. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine, slow, careful, like he was testing a boundary he already knew he would cross. If I let you go, you'll never be safe, not from them, not from me. There it was, the confession buried inside the warning, and for a moment all the lies, all the danger, all the fury dissolved into something quieter, something that felt like surrender. But before the moment could break, before either of us could step closer or further away, a sound shattered the silence. A gunshot, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the halls above us. Dante's head snapped toward the noise, and the mask came back down over his face like armor. Stay here, he said again. But this time it was an order that brooked no argument. He moved fast, the kind of fast that belongs to men who live by instinct, pulling his gun as he disappeared up the stairs. The sound of more shots followed, muffled shouts, the sharp crash of something breaking, and I stood frozen in that cold, narrow room, surrounded by maps and lies and ghosts. And then, through the open doorway, I saw movement. A shadow slipping past the base of the stairs, too quiet to be Dante, too slow to be one of his men. Luca. His eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat neither of us moved. Then he smiled, blood streaked across his cheek, and lifted the gun in his hand. You should have stayed in your cage, he said softly. I turned and ran. The next few seconds blurred, the roar of footsteps behind me, the echo of another shot, the sting of air as I ducked through the narrow corridor that led back toward the main hall. Somewhere above, Dante shouted my name, his voice raw with something that didn't sound like anger. When I burst into the foyer, the night was alive with chaos. Men shouting, glass shattering, the smell of gunpowder thick, in the air. I could see the front doors open, the rain starting again outside, a thin silver curtain falling over the lights of the courtyard, and I ran for it, my lungs burning, my bare feet slipping on the wet marble. Behind me, another shot cracked the air, close enough that I could feel it whistle past. And then suddenly Dante was there, grabbing me, pulling me down behind the grand staircase just as the bullet struck the wall where my head had been a second before. "Are you insane?" he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. "I told you to stay put." "He was coming for me," I gasped. "Luca, he's here." "I know," he said, his tone low and furious, but beneath it there was something else. Relief. He turned, his hand still gripping my arm. "Stay behind me this time, and whatever happens, don't move until I tell you." He stood, the gun steady in his hand, his body a wall between me and the chaos beyond. And as I watched him move into the open, sharp, controlled, lethal, I realized something that made the fear twist into something far more dangerous. Dante Moretti wasn't just fighting to protect his empire anymore. He was fighting to protect me. There are nights that carve themselves into you so deeply that even after they end, their echo stays lodged beneath your skin, whispering, haunting, reminding. And that night, the night the gunfire filled Dante Moretti's house, the night everything I thought I knew about him, about myself, about right and wrong, burned away in a storm of blood and truth, was one of those nights. The kind that doesn't end when the sun rises, because the sun feels too afraid to touch it. The sound of shots seemed to come from everywhere at once, sharp, metallic bursts that shattered the air and made the walls tremble like the house itself was flinching. The smell of gunpowder and rain mingled until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began, and every heartbeat was a countdown I didn't know how to stop. I could see flashes of light through the windows, hear Dante shouting orders in Italian, words that sounded more like oaths than commands. And somewhere between the chaos and the echo of my own breathing, I realized that fear had shifted inside me. It wasn't the cold, helpless kind anymore. It was alive, burning, pulsing with the wild, irrational certainty that I couldn't let him die. When the gunfire paused, the silence that followed was worse. The kind of silence that feels like the whole world is holding its breath before it decides who will still be standing when it exhales. I stepped out from behind the staircase, ignoring the way my legs shook, ignoring the voice in my head that told me to hide, and followed the faint trail of movement and sound toward the east wing, where the doors had been blown open and the rain had begun to spill in, slicking the marble floor with a thin sheen that reflected the bodies of two of Dante's men lying still. And then I saw him. Dante stood at the far end of the hall, framed by the open doorway, his gun still raised, his chest rising and falling too fast. His shirt was torn, a streak of blood across his side that wasn't all his, and at his feet lay Luca, the man who had set everything into motion, one hand clutching his stomach, the other smeared across the floor where he'd tried to crawl away. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The rain hissed against the stone steps outside, thunder rolling somewhere far away, like the earth itself was mourning what it had just witnessed. Luca's laugh broke the quiet first. Wet, broken, but still carrying that same bitter arrogance that had always lived in his eyes. "You're too late," he said, his voice rasping. "You think this ends with me? You think you can stop it?" Dante didn't answer, just stepped closer, the barrel of his gun lowering until it rested against Luca's chest. "I told you once," he said, voice low, steady and dangerous in its restraint. "Loyalty is not something you sell." "Neither is forgiveness," Luca spat, blood catching in his throat. "But I guess you wouldn't know the difference." For a second I thought Dante would shoot him right there, and maybe he should have. But something in his expression shifted, and instead of rage, I saw weariness, the kind that comes from too many battles, too many ghosts. He crouched, grabbed Luca by the collar and said something in Italian that I didn't understand. But the tone, the soft, almost sorrowful tone, told me everything. Then he stood and fired once. The sound was deafening, Luca's body stilled. The silence that followed was final. And then Dante turned to me. He didn't say anything right away, just looked at me like he was trying to remember what words were for, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying something raw underneath. I took a step toward him, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet floor. "You're bleeding." "It's not mine," he said automatically. But when I got closer, I saw that part of it was a jagged slice along his ribs, shallow but bleeding steadily through the soaked fabric of his shirt. "Sit down," I said, more command than suggestion. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "You think I take orders?" "From me," I said, meeting his eyes. "Just this once." Something in my tone must have reached him, because he didn't argue. He sat on the edge of the nearest table, the gun still dangling from his hand, and watched in silence as I tore a strip from the hem of my shirt and pressed it against the wound. He hissed in pain, but didn't move. And for a moment, everything else, the rain, the blood, the chaos, faded until there was only the warmth of his skin beneath my hands and the unbearable nearness of him. "You could have died," I said, quietly, more accusation than fear. He looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not just darkness, but depth. "So could you," he said. "Maybe I should have," I whispered, because it was easier than saying what I really meant. That every minute in his world felt like standing too close to the edge of something beautiful and fatal. "Don't," he said sharply, his hand catching mine, holding it against his chest. His skin was hot, his heartbeat wild beneath my palm. "Don't ever say that." We stayed like that for a long time, his hand still over mine, both of us breathing the same uneven rhythm, both of us knowing that the line we'd been walking, that thin, fragile border between survival and surrender, had just been erased. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher. "You wanted to know why I accused you," he said. "Why I didn't believe you." I nodded, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer anymore. "The last person I trusted," he said slowly, his gaze drifting toward Luca's body, "was someone I loved. She stole from me. Not money, not diamonds, something I can't replace. And when she was gone, all I had left was suspicion. So when the clip disappeared, when your name came up, it was easier to believe the lie than to risk believing you." His words hit harder than any threat ever had, because there was no menace in them. Just truth, quiet and devastating. "I'm not her," I said softly. "I know that now." He let go of my hand then, but the absence of his touch felt louder than the thunder outside. He stood, wincing slightly, and walked to the window, staring out at the rain. "This isn't over," he said after a moment. "Luca was a pawn. Someone else is pulling the strings." "Rosario," I said. He nodded. "He'll know by now that Luca's dead, and he'll want to finish what he started." "What are you going to do?" He turned, his face unreadable again, the mask slipping back into place, though I could still see the cracks beneath it. "What I always do," he said. "End it before it ends me." Something in his tone chilled me. Not because of what it promised, but because of what it didn't. There was no trace of hope in it. No sense that he expected to survive whatever came next. And before I could stop myself, before I could remind myself that this was a man who had accused me, threatened me, trapped me in his world, I stepped closer and touched his arm. "Then let me help," I said. He looked at me, and this time, when his eyes met mine, there was no control, no distance, no pretense, only exhaustion, and the faintest glimmer of something like surrender. "You already have," he said quietly. And then he kissed me. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate and furious and real. The collision of two people who had spent too long pretending they didn't need anyone, who had been circling the same fire and finally stepped into it. His hand tangled in my hair. Mine gripped the back of his neck, and for that one impossible moment the rest of the world disappeared. When he pulled away, his breath trembled against my cheek. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, though his voice was already betraying him. "Maybe I was meant to," I whispered. He looked at me like he wanted to believe that, like believing it might save him from everything else. But then his expression hardened again, and he turned away, reaching for his gun. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we finish this." And as I watched him walk out into the rain, his figure vanishing into the storm he'd built and could no longer control, I realized that whatever waited for us next wasn't justice or redemption. It was survival, and one of us wasn't going to make it out alive. The morning after felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to decide whether to push you forward or let you fall on your own. And even before I opened my eyes, I could feel it in the air. That unnatural stillness that comes before something violent. The kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. Trembling, inevitable, aching to break. I woke to the faint hum of engines outside, the low murmur of men's voices carrying through the open windows, and the smell of oil and gunmetal hanging in the air like perfume. Dante's house, usually wrapped in the kind of immaculate calm that made you forget the world beyond its walls even existed, now felt alive with motion, every hallway echoing with footsteps, every shadow vibrating with urgency. Something was happening. Something final. When I stepped into the corridor, one of his men, a tall, grim-faced man whose name I still didn't know, stopped me before I could go any farther. "He's in the study," he said, and though his tone was respectful, there was pity in his eyes, a quiet understanding that whatever I was about to walk into was going to change everything. The door to the study was half open, and through the crack I saw Dante standing by the window, his back to me, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. Papers littered the desk beside him. Maps, notes, photos. The chaos of a man who'd spent the night preparing for war. His jacket hung over the chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the muscles in his arms taut beneath the tension of stillness. For a moment I didn't say anything. I just watched him, the way the early light caught in his hair, the way smoke curled around his profile, the way he looked both untouchable and unbearably human at once. Then quietly I said, "You haven't slept." He didn't turn. Sleep is a luxury for men who aren't being hunted. Rosario won't stop, will he? "He doesn't know how," Dante said, exhaling smoke that hung like fog between us. "He's already sent word. He's coming for me tonight. He wants what's his." "What's his?" I repeated, moving closer. "The diamonds." He finally looked at me then, and the faint smile that crossed his face wasn't amusement. It was exhaustion wrapped in irony. "No," he said softly. "Me." The words sank into me like stones into water, rippling outward, dark and cold and heavy. "Why?" "Because I was his," he said, his gaze drifting back toward the window. "Once. Before all this." I waited, but he didn't elaborate. And maybe he didn't need to. The truth was there in the way he said it. The unspoken confession of two men who had built an empire together and then torn it apart. Brothers by loyalty, enemies by greed. "What will you do?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "What I was born to do," he said. "Finish it." The finality in his tone made my stomach twist. "You think you can survive this?" He met my gaze again, and in his eyes I saw both the man and the myth. The one who had built his life out of violence, who had clawed his way out of the dirt, only to find that power was just another kind of prison. "I stopped thinking about survival a long time ago," he said. Now I just make sure the people who deserve to die do it before I do." He turned back to the desk, his hands moving over the maps, the weapons, the cold geometry of war. "You shouldn't be here," he said after a while without looking at me. "I'll have someone take you to a safe house before dark." "No." That made him look at me again, sharply, like he'd heard something impossible. "No?" "I'm not running again," I said, my voice trembling but steady in its truth. "I've spent my whole life letting people decide where I belong, what I can survive, who I can be. Not anymore. If this ends tonight, I'm not hiding from it." For a long moment he said nothing, and in that silence I saw the conflict in him. The part that wanted to protect me, the part that wanted to push me away, and the part that had already accepted that maybe I was too much like him now to save. Finally he said, "You don't understand what being near me means, Ava. You don't understand what you'll lose." I took a step closer, close enough to smell the smoke and the faint trace of whiskey on his skin. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what it's cost you." He stared at me for a long time, his eyes searching mine as though the truth was hidden somewhere inside me. And then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "Everything." The word felt final, but before I could respond, the sound of engines outside grew louder. The low, unmistakable rumble of approaching cars. Dante stiffened, his hand going automatically to the gun on the table. "They're early," he said under his breath, more to himself than to me. "Of course they are." I ran to the window and saw them. A line of black SUVs, pulling up along the gravel drive, men spilling out with rifles, their faces hidden by the masks of those who had already chosen death over mercy. The sun hadn't even broken the horizon yet, but already the world was on fire. "Get down," Dante ordered, pushing me away from the window as the first burst of gunfire shattered the glass. The sound was deafening, glass spraying across the room like shards of light. I hit the floor, covering my head, and through the chaos I heard Dante shouting, his voice calm, commanding, terrifying in its certainty. The fight moved through the house like a storm, sharp, violent, consuming. Dante's men returned fire from the hallways and windows, their shouts mixing with the sound of bullets, of splintering wood, of bodies hitting the floor. The air filled with smoke, with the acrid sting of gunpowder, with the taste of something that felt like the end of the world. I crawled toward the overturned desk, my hands shaking, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. Dante was a blur of motion, precise, lethal, unstoppable. And for a moment I understood why people feared him. He didn't fight like a man trying to live. He fought like a man who had already accepted death and wanted to take as many ghosts with him as he could. Then I saw Rosario. He appeared in the doorway at the far end of the hall, older than I remembered, meaner, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He held his gun steady, his focus locked on Dante, and time seemed to stretch, to slow, to hold its breath the way I had when I first met him. "Moretti," Rosario said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic." Dante didn't answer. He raised his gun, but Rosario was faster. The shot hit Dante in the shoulder, spinning him backward. I screamed without realizing it, running toward him. But before I could reach him, Rosario's hand caught my wrist, yanking me back with surprising strength. "Well," he said, smiling that cold, cruel smile that made my stomach turn, "if it isn't the car washer girl, the famous thief." "Let me go," I hissed, struggling, but he only tightened his grip. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, leaning close enough that I could smell the sourness of his breath, the stench of arrogance. "You think you were just a pawn in his game, but you were mine first." His words froze me. "What are you talking about?" He smiled wider. "Your brother. The debt. You think he borrowed money from the wrong people by accident? I sent him. I sent him to Moretti's men because I needed leverage, and then you walked right into my hands. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. You're lying, he chuckled. Am I? Dante staggered to his feet behind him, blood soaking his sleeve, his face pale but his eyes burning. Let her go, Rosario, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. Rosario turned, still holding me in front of him like a shield, his gun pressed against my ribs. Or what? You'll shoot through her? I taught you better than that. The look on Dante's face, that mixture of fury and helplessness, was almost worse than the pain of Rosario's grip. You were always too sentimental, Rosario said. That's why I win. And then, before I could even think, before I could process what I was doing, I did the only thing I could. I drove my elbow back into his ribs as hard as I could, twisting out of his hold just as the gun went off. The noise was blinding, the pain immediate and searing, and for a moment everything disappeared into white. When my vision cleared, Rosario was on the ground, blood blooming across his chest, Dante standing over him with the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. But then I looked down and saw it. The red spreading across my own side, hot and sticky beneath my fingers, the shock hitting harder than the pain. Dante dropped the gun, his face draining of color, as he caught me before I fell. No, he whispered, his voice breaking. No, no, no. The world tilted again, the edges of the room blurring, the sound of gunfire fading into a distant echo. I tried to speak, to tell him I was fine, that it didn't hurt, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was his face, fierce, desperate, human, and the faint tremor of his lips as he whispered something I couldn't hear. There are moments in life that split you in half. The before and the after. The light and the dark. The person you were and the stranger who comes after. And when I woke to the smell of smoke and antiseptic and rain, I knew I had crossed that invisible line, and that there was no going back to whatever version of myself had existed before that night. The ceiling above me was white, cracked in one corner, the kind of imperfection that seems insignificant, until you realize it's the only real thing in a world made of lies. And as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I understood I wasn't dead. Not yet. Though the pain in my side pulsed like a second heartbeat, hot and uneven and alive. For a while I just lay there, drifting in and out of that fog between consciousness and oblivion, catching fragments of voices, men talking in low tones, the rustle of paper, the click of a door, until one voice, low and familiar and frayed around the edges, cut through it all like a thread pulling me back to the surface. You're safe, Dante said, though his voice didn't sound certain, and when I turned my head and saw him sitting beside the bed, his hand wrapped around mine, I realized he wasn't saying it for me. He was saying it to convince himself. He looked different, older somehow, though I knew it hadn't been more than a day or two since the shooting. His hair was uncombed, his shirt rumpled and stained with blood that I knew wasn't mine, his eyes hollow but burning. And for the first time since I met him, he didn't look like a man in control of the world. He looked like a man fighting against it. What happened? I whispered, my throat raw, the words scraping out like glass. He hesitated, like he didn't want to say it, like saying it would make it too real. Rosario's dead, he said finally. The others scattered. It's over. Over. The word felt too small for what had happened, too empty to hold the weight of all that blood and loss and silence. And me? I asked, though the answer was obvious. He brushed his thumb across my knuckles, his touch gentle, reverent, careful in a way that didn't belong to a man like him. You almost didn't make it, he said quietly. The bullet grazed your lung. They said if I'd brought you in 10 minutes later. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. I looked at him for a long time, the edges of his face soft in the half-light, the faint tremor in his hands betraying the calm he was trying to wear. "You saved me," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't joy. It was exhaustion shaped into something that only resembled relief. "You saved me first," he said. And though I wanted to believe it, part of me knew that saving each other was never what we were built for. He stayed by my side for hours, or maybe it was days. Time didn't make sense anymore. Rarely speaking, just sitting there, always close enough to touch but never crossing that final inch, as though proximity was the only kind of forgiveness either of us could afford. Sometimes I woke to find him asleep in the chair, head bowed, the gun he refused to put down resting on his knee like a reminder that peace in his world was just another kind of danger. When I was finally strong enough to stand, he helped me walk to the window. We were in a house I didn't recognize, smaller, quieter, hidden away from the noise of the city. And outside, the world looked impossibly calm. The garden was overgrown, wild and unkept, a strange kind of beauty that didn't belong to men like Dante but somehow suited him now. This broken version of himself who had traded empire for solitude. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure who I was asking, him or myself. He took a long breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was trying to rise through a curtain of gray. "Now," he said, "you leave. You go back to your life. You forget my name." The words should have felt like freedom, but instead they landed like a blade. "You think I can forget?" "You have to," he said, turning toward me. "You're not like me, Ava. You were never supposed to be part of this." I laughed, though it came out closer to a sob. "It's too late for that." He reached out, his hand brushing my face, the touch feather light, but filled with everything he couldn't say. "Then at what?" "Least be smarter than me," he whispered. "Walk away before the darkness becomes home." I wanted to argue, to tell him that walking away from him wasn't the same as walking toward the light, that the line between his world and mine had already blurred too much to separate cleanly. But before I could, he let go and stepped back, the distance between us feeling heavier than any wall. "Where will you go?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Men like me don't go anywhere. We just fade." I didn't see him again for 3 days. The doctor said I was healing faster than expected, that I'd be able to leave soon. But the silence in the house had started to feel like a warning, the kind that hums just before something breaks. I found his jacket draped over the back of a chair, his watch on the nightstand, but no sign of him. And then, that night, as the storm began to roll back over the city, he came back. Soaked, silent, eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "You went after them," I said, not even a question. He didn't deny it. There were still loose ends. "Dante!" "It's done," he interrupted softly, though the words sounded like a prayer more than a statement. "No more blood, no more debts, just done." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw the truth, that this was goodbye, that whatever thread had held us together had already begun to fray, that love, if that's what this was, couldn't survive in a world that demanded sacrifice as currency. "I'm leaving tonight," he said. "You'll stay here until you're ready. There's money in the drawer, enough to start over." "And you?" He smiled. That faint, haunted smile that had always felt like both a promise and an apology. "I don't get to start over." The air between us trembled. I wanted to reach for him, to stop him, to ask him to stay. But something in his eyes told me that this was the only way either of us would ever be free. So instead, I said the only thing I could. "Thank you." He stepped closer, brushed his hand against my hair, his touch lingering just a second too long. "You stood your ground," he said softly. "Even when I gave you every reason not to. Don't ever lose that." and then he was gone. The door closed behind him, the sound echoing through the empty house like the last heartbeat of something too wild to last. For a long time I just stood there, listening to the rain, to the quiet that followed, to the strange ache that filled the space he'd left behind. Part of me wanted to run after him, to scream that none of this made sense, that we were both too broken to pretend the world could ever make room for us. But another part, the part that had learned too much, lost too much, knew that this was how it had to end. I left 2 days later. The city felt different when I returned, smaller somehow, quieter, like it had exhaled while I was gone. The garage was still there, though boarded up, the paint peeling, the sign half fallen, and for a while I just stood outside, watching the ghosts of what used to be. The echo of engines, the laughter. The girl who had once believed that hard work could keep her safe. That girl was gone now. But in her place stood someone else. Someone who had looked into the eyes of power and refused to look away. Someone who had been accused, betrayed, wounded, and somehow still standing. Sometimes at night, I hear the low growl of an engine passing through my street, smooth, expensive, familiar. And for a moment, my heart stops, waiting for the impossible. And though he never comes, I like to imagine him out there somewhere, alive, untouchable, still watching the world burn from the edges of its light. I don't know if love can survive the kind of darkness we walked through, but I know this. Once you've been seen by someone like Dante Moretti, really seen, the world never looks the same again. Because love, when it's born from fire and ruin, doesn't fade. It lingers. Like smoke in your lungs, like a scar you don't want to heal, like a name that still tastes like sin when you whisper it into the dark. And sometimes, when the rain falls just right, I swear I can still smell his cologne on the wind. Sharp, woodsy, dangerous. And I remember what he told me the night it all began. You stole from me. And maybe I did. But it wasn't his diamonds I took. It was his heart. And I never gave it back.